afternoon. I'm your host, Melissa Ridgen. In the 1960s and 70s, Dryden, Ontario, a pulp and paper mill in Dryden, Ontario, it's located in northwestern Ontario. They were dumping mercury into the English and Wabigoon river systems. So soon after, people began getting sick, people living on First Nations communities along the river who rely on fish to survive. It was eventually determined that they had been poisoned from eating the fish. Decades later, scientists say as many as 90% of those people living in Grassy Narrows and further downstream in White Dog have symptoms of mercury poisoning. Yet only 30% of them receive a few $100s a month in disability money. The community is fighting for more people to get disability money and to have the river system cleaned up and to have a facility built that would allow people with mercury poisoning to be treated in their community, which numerous people say is entirely possible, actually, to clean up the river system, but you need a political will. A protester took this message to a Liberal fundraiser last week, and the Prime Minister met her with a smug remark, which we'll get to in a bit. Today, we are putting mercury poisoning in focus. What effects are still being felt in these communities, how the problem is getting worse, what needs to be done to help. We want you to join our conversation. You can call us. Our phone lines are open, toll-free, 1-877-647-2786. You can also tweet us at APTN in Focus. Before I introduce you to our guests, here's a snippet from a story I did back in 2017 for APTN Investigates called Then the Mercury Hit. This is Steve Fobister Sr. He's only 64. Aged by mercury poisoning, which devastates the nervous system of its victims. A pulp and paper mill dumped 10 tons of the neurotoxin upstream from his home on the Grassy Narrows First Nation during the 1960s. They live on fish. Fish that for 50 years has been crippling them. Killing them. In 1986, the federal and provincial governments and the companies that owned the polluting Dryden paper mill came up with a $16 million settlement for Grassy Narrows and White Dog, a community further downstream that had also been affected.
Important to note, they never did divide it up in the first place. If they would have received approximately $14,000 each if they had done it that way.
Instead, a Mercury Disability Board was established to manage the money and determine who gets it. Anywhere from $250 to $800 a month, less than welfare, for having your life stolen, if you even get compensation. Their daughters are quite young, right? Gabe Fobister was Grassy's representative on the Mercury Disability Board.
Very seldom some people get it, eh?
Yeah.
And some just more frustrated, you know, why they don't get awarded.
Only 314 people have ever received benefits. Currently, just 191 people get compensation. 70% of the people who apply are denied.
A lot of those folks have suffered and died with very little recognition, never mind compensation.
Steve Fobister, who we just saw in that documentary, passed away in October, crippled from mercury poisoning and the effects of diabetes. So given the gravity of the situation and the inaction of 2 levels of government for half a century, a woman crashed a $1,500 a plate Liberal fundraising dinner last week to drive the point home. Here's what happens.
This is the video that made the rounds on social media.
People in Grassy Narrows are suffering from mercury poisoning. You committed to addressing this crisis.
Thank you for being here. Thank you very much for your donation tonight. I really appreciate it.
The woman was escorted out of a Liberal fundraiser last night in Toronto to applause. Today, the Prime Minister found himself apologizing for his remarks.
Last night, I lacked respect towards them, and I apologize for that. It is obviously an issue that they feel take very seriously, and as I now understand, it involved their child possibly.
The video that was posted to Twitter by user Free Grassy has gone viral. It has close to 300,000 views by Thursday afternoon.
The Liberal Party is filled with different perspectives and different opinions, and we respect them all, and our commitment to reconciliation continues to be strong and committed, and we will continue to engage.
Many have since criticized the Prime Minister, calling his response smug to a situation that has affected First Nations communities for decades. In a tweet, NDP MP Romeo Saganash says, just another telling episode about how he really doesn't care about Indigenous rights and people. Assembly of First Nations Chief Perry Bellegarde called the comments unacceptable and offensive. Grassy Narrows has long argued to both the provincial and federal governments that they've suffered mercury poisoning from contaminated water. In 2017, the Ontario government committed $85 million to clean up the damage done by a paper mill in nearby Dryden during the 60s and 70s. Earlier testing revealed about 90% of the people living in Grassy Narrows and Wabsumung First Nations have experienced symptoms of mercury poisoning. Trudeau says he will instruct his Indigenous Services Minister to work hard to find a solution.
The situation in Grassy Narrows is one that we have been following for quite a while. It involves elements of provincial jurisdiction and federal responsibility.
In a statement, the chief of Grassy Narrows says, we acknowledge the Prime Minister's apology. However, he must be reminded of the urgency of this matter and the ongoing struggle and threats to the health of First Nations citizens because of environmental contamination for over 50 years. Willow Fiddler, APTN National News.
Joining us now is Grassy Narrows Chief Rudy Turtle. His dad was a fishing guide and his mom a commercial fisher. Both lost their livelihood in an instant when mercury poisoning hit the river system. An hour and a half from the nearest town, many people had to stay on the reserve with no job and a lot of free time. That's when social problems took hold, compounding the struggle of being a poisoned community. And Judy De Silva, Grassy Narrows Environmental Health Coordinator, she's been a decades-long advocate for her community, pushing for proper compensation for those who have been poisoned. She also fights against government letting industry anywhere near their territory, given how it's devastated the community. I thank you guys both for traveling to come here. Thanks. So before I get chatting about what the Prime Minister said and what the protest was all about, just share with our audience what the effects are still of people suffering from mercury poisoning. This isn't a historic problem that's gotten better. Explain to us.
Being the environmental health coordinator, we've done 4 contaminant studies. When Health Canada told us in 1997 there's no more mercury in the river system. And at the time, one of the nurses, if she hadn't asked the question, well, how come you're still warning the sports fishermen to eat just a little bit of fish? If she hadn't asked that question, I wouldn't have asked the late Trish Sellers and Dr. Leanne Simpson to help me do like a contaminant study. We would have been still back there.
Yeah.
And when the nurse asked that question, that kind of got everything rolling. And our people have done so many environmental gatherings, youth gatherings, and so it's been driven by the people to ask these questions. And it's been because of our health problems that we have pursued this. It's not like, it's almost like you're being told there is no mercury, but then you still feel sick. Like I suffer from mercury poisoning, and I know I'm deteriorating, and like the one symptom is like being off balance, and that was happening to me even to about an hour ago, where my daughter had to help me like stay balanced. So the mercury attacks the brain, and you could still be really highly intelligent, but your body gives up on you. Like you lose your balance.
It's a neurological impairment.
And you shake, and
hearing loss. We'll get into some of the other symptoms that you guys see. But how many people in your community?
Well, there's 1,000 people in the community, but
on reserve.
On reserve, but our registry is over 1,600.
And how many people have some effects of mercury poisoning? What percentage?
I would say all of them, everybody.
But as we saw in the documentary, or the little snippet of the documentary, 30% of people who apply for disability funding, only 30% of the people who apply actually qualify as being mercury poisoned. Can we get into a little bit of why? You sit on the Mercury Disability Board. You can explain why, if everybody has mercury poisoning, the vast majority, and only a third of the people get compensation, what's the problem?
Well, they use a point system, and we have a physician that looks at people, that he examines the people that, they have appointments with him, he examines them. But the examination is not the best, and his the way he does it, I would say, is pretty much to his discretion. There is no real guideline or criteria that he. Most of the people in the community have complained about him and the way he's been assessing people. It hasn't been consistent, so it's not very good.
Well, there's a sense, I think, from the times that I've been into the community, there's a sense that the system is set up to not compensate people, keep as few people on it as possible, right? Is there something that could, are you fighting to change the criteria around who gets compensation?
Well, we've been hoping to do that. We did have a Mercury Disability Board review, but it's been very slow.
How slow? It's been 50 years. So how much more time are these people going to take?
Well, that's what the frustration is. Things are so slow. Like you said, it's 50 years, and we keep protesting and we keep asking and to try to improve things, but it just doesn't really get anywhere.
So we'll get into, you had mentioned protesting. You've been protesting and protesting. For one, another thing that we should mention too before we go on is that the government of Ontario found evidence in, 2007? That there's still super high level of mercury present in the water system. Is that right?
As late as last year, they still found high levels of
still
mercury.
Testing, and it's still well above acceptable levels. Ontario committed $85 million to clean up the river system. Scientists say that it's entirely possible to do, right? How are we moving forward on that? When does that get going?
Well, we have the English Wabigoon River Remediation Program happening that was set up by Kathleen Wynne. And what's been happening is for 2 years, there'll be field sampling of the river system. So the scientists can get a better profile of where the most toxic parts of the river is, where the highest concentration of mercury is. And for people to understand, the listeners, 10 tons of mercury was dumped into the river system.
Yeah.
So that's 20 half-ton trucks, 24 trucks piled on top of each other. So that's really massive. And in any other community, if that much poison was spilled into a river system, there'll be a big outcry. And for us, the engineers are working on still doing field sampling, so they're getting fish samples and crayfish and mud samples, sediment sampling. And just a little while ago, they gave us a full report of what they did last year, and there's still high levels of mercury, especially in Clay Lake, which is between Dryden and Grassy. Clay Lake has been said in the Ontario Fishing Guide, it's the highest in mercury in Ontario, which is right along our river system.
And I think we have a caller. Florence. Florence, are you there?
Yes, I am.
How are you?
Absolutely gobsmacked, because I remember hearing about Grassy Narrows when I was a young woman, and I'm now 71. And I would like to please encourage your members on the panel, please do not give up on this battle. Please do not be encouraged. The bottle of clear water is established one drop at a time. I encourage you, please do not relinquish this fight. Everybody must be taught what we have the responsibility to do to carry through on making our land safe again.
Thank you.
Please, 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 I can only give you my prayers, but I will be praying.
Awesome.
People.
Thank you so much, Florence. Thanks. So, I mean, you guys have a lot of support across the country for this. I want to just take a second before we're going to have to wrap this up pretty quickly, but I want to just take a break. For people who are watching at home, you might not know what we talk about mercury poisoning, but let's explain. So mercury is used in the making of paper. The paper mill that was in Dryden was then dumping mercury into the lake. It flows downstream, and all along the way is poisoning plants and animals. The fish eat the plants and become mercury poisoned. Fish are eaten by bigger fish who become mercury poisoned. And then people eat the fish, and they too are mercury poisoned. In Grassy Narrows and White Dog, fish was a dietary staple in every home, from small children to the elderly. And the symptoms of mercury poisoning occur slowly. They include visual impairment, slurred speech or impaired speech, muscle weakness, hearing loss, decreased cognitive function, just meaning your brain doesn't work at the pace, the standard that it's supposed to anymore. Numbness in your extremities, stinging pain in your extremities like hands and feet, and you can have burning in your mouth. Okay, so I want to get to your thoughts now on, so now that we know the extent of the mercury poisoning, the effects of the mercury poisoning, we've got a protest at a Liberal fundraiser, and the Prime Minister says, "Thank you for your donation." Smug response. When you watched that, what were your thoughts, Judy?
Well, in my thoughts, I was thinking it's just a typical response.
You weren't surprised?
No. Like, we're used to that kind of callous attitude to Indigenous people, and we've been dealing with like several different forms of government throughout the years since the mercury has been discovered, and it's taken this long. And we're still protesting, and we're still out there like trying to get mercury justice for our people. So for me, it wasn't a surprise.
Rudy, I mean, you deal with this government. You deal with this Prime Minister. You've dealt with this government. You hear those words come out of his mouth in response to a problem that has debilitated your community. What's your reaction when you hear it?
Well, first of all, like, I feel very disappointed, and also I feel insulted because as Judy mentioned, like, our people are being poisoned, people are suffering, and there's just not a proper response coming from the Prime Minister of Canada.
Well, and he said he's sorry after. He said, "Oh, sorry, that was disrespectful." What do you make of his apology?
Well, we acknowledge his apology, but we're not, until we see further action or, you know, get something done. Or I'm referring to the facility that we're building in Grassy that we hope to be built. Until that's done.
What facility?
It's a mercury treatment facility for the people that are suffering mercury poisoning. Until that gets done, and in addition, we've been inviting him to come to the community so that he could see it firsthand. Until he takes these serious actions, then we would, you know, see that his apology is sincere. But right now, I just don't.
Well, he did have his minister, Seamus O'Regan, who replaced Jane Philpott. He had his minister give you a shout today. What did Mr. O'Regan have to say?
He said that he's going to visit the community shortly, in a couple of weeks. And he also said that he's going to work with us with the facility, that he's committed to keep it going.
Jane Philpott had committed to the Mercury Treatment Center, is that correct?
Yes.
How much money did she say the feds would kick in?
At the time when she made the announcement, she didn't give a money amount.
Okay.
But she did say that the facility and the services would be taken care of. And that was November 28, 2017.
Okay.
That she made that commitment. It wasn't just like words, it's like She's firmly committed.
That was 2 years ago.
Yeah.
And here we sit. Has it started to be built yet? No bricks going up? But O'Regan phoned you today to say, still committing to the commitment that we've not done anything on for 2 years.
Yeah.
Cute. Okay, we're going to take a quick break. But we've got more discussion to come for sure when we come back after the break. Stay tuned. Join our conversation now. You can call in toll-free at 1-877-647-2786. Like and watch us live on the APTN News Facebook page. Follow and tweet us at APTN in Focus, and send your thoughts in an email to infocus@aptn.ca. Welcome back. Let's go to social media now to hear what some of you are saying about today's topic. We asked, do you believe Prime Minister Justin Trudeau's apology is sincere to Grassy Narrows mercury poisoning activists? Why or why not? Priscilla says, no, he laughed and thought it was funny. There's so much for this young Prime Minister to learn. Ralph says, a sincere apology would be accompanied by a plan to funding to rectify the problem. Donna says, he is such an arrogant man, and just as horrific was the laughter of those Liberal supporters in the room. Tanya says, what he did was shocking. He's already demonstrated his true level of concern through complete non-action, but trying to publicly humiliate someone who's trying to speak on behalf of the victims, he usually saves his true nature for more private surroundings, which is why his behavior in public surprised me as it did. Doreen says, Justin Trudeau is just like his father. He hates Indians and is doing everything to keep them sick. You have liberals like Carolyn Bennett, a physician, doing nothing to get medical attention to Grassy Narrows. Reconciliation is dead. Well, if you would like to add your opinion to our topic of conversation, here's how you can do that. Join our conversation now. You can call in toll-free at 1-877-647-2786. Like and watch us live on the APTN News Facebook page. Follow and tweet us at APTN In Focus, and send your thoughts in an email to infocus@aptn.ca. Back in 2012, I talked to members of the Wabascong First Nation who were fighting to be recognized as victims of mercury poisoning. They were the closest to the polluting Dryden pulp and paper mill, and when they started dying, the federal government shuffled them off to a village called Quebec. So the treatment of these people might be even worse than how the Ontario and federal governments have treated White Dog and Grassy Narrows victims. Let's take a listen.
Affairs knew where we were living because we were getting yearly, what do you call those payouts? Treaty payouts. So they must have known where we were, but somehow when it came time for compensation, we just were not included.
In the 60s and 70s, a pulp and paper mill in Dryden dumped tens of thousands of pounds of mercury-contaminated wastewater into the Wabigoon River. The company and the Ontario and Canadian governments set up a $16 million fund in the mid-1980s to compensate Grassy Narrows and White Dog band members who got sick from drinking contaminated water and eating the fish. Wabascong families had left their traditional territory, and many moved to Quebec, located on the Wabigoon River system downstream from Dryden.
They were hit with smallpox and TB, so they thought they were cursed, so they left.
When it became clear the people further down the river system in Grassy Narrows and White Dog were sick from mercury, Indian and Northern Affairs Canada quickly moved the Wabascong members from Quebec back to their original land without mentioning the contamination they'd been exposed to.
We were the first ones hit before Grassy and White Dog were hit.
The men, they had neurological problems. They'd have facial twitches, and there were some that were slightly retarded or they were slow. They had speech impediments. The women had different problems. They'd have bone problems and stomach problems, stomach ailments.
Then there were the babies.
The babies were the first ones that were hit. They were always crying all the time and things like that. By the time they're 5 or 6 months, they're gone. They're dead. My little brother lasted longer because my mother had breastfed him from birth, and then he only lived 9 months.
Betty suspects the tremors she suffers are from mercury exposure. She is part of a class action lawsuit trying to get compensation. Earlier this month, she and Williams pleaded with Ontario Aboriginal Affairs Minister Kathleen Wynne to take up the cause of the Wabascong sufferers.
What is wrong with us? Why the government won't do anything? I mean, we're people too.
Lawyers for the group didn't return calls for comment on this story. Ontario's Aboriginal Affairs Minister says there simply isn't a funding source available to compensate these residents. Meanwhile, Aboriginal Affairs and Northern Development Canada deferred all questions to the Mercury Compensation Board. But the Mercury Compensation Board is only mandated to deal with claimants from White Dog and Grassy Narrows. And so the Wabascong residents remain without answers and without compensation. For APTN National News, I'm Melissa Ridgen in Winnipeg. I was hoping that we could have Betty Riffle come on and explain sort of how things are going with the class action lawsuit that they've filed for compensation, and was unable to reach her. So we have a caller, I understand. David from BC, are you there? Hello?
Hello.
Hey, how are you?
I'm doing well, thank you very much.
Good. Did you have questions or comments?
Well, my comments, I was in Japan at Minamata Bay in the early 70s, and
I just explained to our listeners and our viewers Minamata and how it's relevant to the conversation about mercury poisoning.
Right. Well, Minamata is where people first learned about mercury poisoning, and it was through people observing fish being eaten by cats in the bay, and then the cats became sick, and some of them were, well, they'd actually drown. They'd walk into the water and drown. They were so disoriented by the poison. So one of the people who brought it to public attention, Dr. Sadao Ichikawa from over there, was whom I met with, and we actually brought him to Grassy Narrows and White Dog back in 1977.
Oh, neat. Oh, well, I knew that he was there, but I didn't know that. That's very interesting that you were part of that group of people who got him to Grassy Narrows to study the effects of mercury poisoning on the population there. So, I mean, you've then been following this for decades?
It's been a while, yeah. That was the United Nations conference in Vancouver when people in Canada first learned about it.
So how are you feeling? I mean, it's now 2019 and we're having this conversation. How are you?
It's disgusting. It's terrible. This should have been dealt with decades ago.
And you know, at any point have you been, as you watch this, have you ever been hopeful or like, oh, I think we might finally get some justice here, or we might get some movement? Have you ever been in a position to feel that amount of hope?
I haven't seen any signs of hope in this issue at all.
I kind of thought that would be your answer. So are you still involved out in BC and in the Grassy Narrows fight?
Well, just in this kind of way right now, just talking about it with people. I'm an environmentalist, but I work with trees at this stage of my life. So I'm actually trying to protect certain forested areas here, and that's a full-time operation.
Cool. Well, I'm thankful that you took the time to give us a show today. Thanks for listening.
Well, you bet. You know, I mean, the congenital side of things is where you got to focus a little bit now, because it's the children of the victims that are be carrying forward the horror of this into the future. And then who knows what happens with their children and whether they can even have children. I mean, there's so much left undiscussed and unexplored, for that matter, in Canada about mercury poisoning.
Disgusting. Well, thank you very much for calling, David. Have a great day.
Yeah, you bet. Okay, thank you. Bye-bye.
So one thing that we had mentioned earlier in the show was about the pitiful compensation that is offered to victims of mercury poisoning. There was a fund that had been set out, and you're doled out. We discussed some of the problems with even determining who passes the exam to qualify for the disability money. But then that money, it had been stagnant for how many years without any cost of living increases?
Up till last year.
So from the 80s until last year, the amount had stayed the same. So we talked about amounts before. I guess our listeners on Element FM radio in Toronto and Ottawa wouldn't have seen it, but we had some graphics that show what was the amounts that people were getting from 1980s till last year. What was the range of monthly income?
Like mine was $250 a month.
And the max end of it, people like
$800.
Steve Phobister, who are completely debilitated. So anywhere from $200 to $800 a month is what you get for being poisoned. Earlier in the summer, the Doug Ford government comes in and they pick up the ball from the previous Liberal government, which had said that we were going to increase the payments to mercury poisoning victims. What did the payments go up to?
It was rated to inflation. So
and backdated, right?
Indexed to backdated. So it wasn't like really up, it was just up according to the cost of living. So now like mine is $547 a month. So it's double.
More than doubled.
From the $250. And the ones that were getting $800 probably get $1,600 a month now. But it's like, all it is like 5% of the population. It's not all of Grassy. That's the misconception people have.
It's not even, sorry, you just said it's 5% of your population. I thought it was 30% of your population.
No, like the Mercury Disability Board, they get like $1 million a year to dole out this compensation or disability payments. And since the last fall, we got the indexation, but it's only 5% of between White Dog and Grassy together, population. It's not all of us. So in Wapsamung, they have like maybe 2,000 people. Grassy, we have 1,400, so it's almost 4,000 people. And only 5% of those 4,000 get the Mercury disability payments. And that's where like I'd like him to speak on that part.
Yeah.
Region.
How do we get more people getting the compensation?
Well, we've been asking the governments to that's the message we're sending to the Prime Minister and also to the Premier of Ontario, that everybody should be compensated instead of this 5% of people. Like we would like everybody that's living in Grassy Narrows and White Dog, like everyone that's been affected, just to be compensated right across the board.
And what type is when you say compensation, you mean like a monthly amount, or are you talking like a settlement? What's the ask?
Well, we're asking for both, the monthly compensation they're getting, but we're also asking that, and we feel that it's the right thing to do because we lost our fishing economy for the last 50 years. So I think that needs to be addressed and that should be compensated. In addition, for the last 50 years, our people, our children have been suffering from mercury, and that has to be compensated. So we're looking at both of them.
And I thought I had it in my notes here, and I do. So just so people at home, you said like lost the ability for fishing, there's no industry or anything, there's nothing left for Grassy. I just want to say, so before the mercury hit, Grassy Narrows had Ball Lake Lodge, Grassy Lodge, a marina, English River Fishing Adventures. The Grassy Narrows Corporation was big enough that it could employ a large chunk of the community, correct? Other sources of jobs, so we have an administration office, logging business, there was trappers, there was stores, there was a district heating business. All of that just is gone. When the mercury hits, it's gone like that. And we've got, now what in terms of economics?
Well, pretty much we have nothing now because mercury took that all away, and there's nothing for the people that used to fish during the summer. There's nothing for them to do. And
I mean, if you want to go and work somewhere, you're an hour and a half away from the nearest town.
Yeah.
So let's talk about the mercury treatment center that the Jane Philpott had committed to, in theory, a couple of years ago. What exactly would be at that center? What services would it offer for people?
We went to Japan, Minamata, Japan, like a few times. I've gone 3 times, and they have a hospital there, and you can't cure mercury poisoning, right, but you can make the sufferer be more comfortable. And what's happening is we end up in the Kenora hospitals, and our people are tied to the bed, just skin and bones at the end of their life. So we wanted, what we said is we want this home in our community where our people take care of them and they'll be taken care of in a humane way. And that's the point, is for our people to be taken care of by our own people in a non-racist way, because people deny there's even mercury in our community. And I've even heard of a general practitioner from Kenora telling our people there is no such thing as mercury poisoning, get it out of your mind, it's a scam. But we all know by our symptoms, and the world-renowned mercury expert, Dr. Donna Mergler, is working with us. And she came out with a health survey results, shows that we are poisoned by mercury. And then
I love that you need to be told, like you need somebody to rubber stamp this for you, right? It's incredible.
That's the continual struggle we have, is to be treated as human beings in every way, like economic, social, health. It goes on and on, like how our people are so mistreated and misunderstood.
I think it's interesting how, so this, and I don't remember, because it was a long time ago that I did this story, but I don't remember what it was that contaminated Minamata Bay, what type of industry it was that polluted Minamata Bay with the mercury. But Japan has handled the mercury poisoning there much differently than Canada. Can either of you speak to how Japan responded to the poisoning of its residents.
They had 174 tons of mercury dumped into their sea, and they cleaned it up, and then they capped it, and then where they put it on the land, they put the Minamata Center on there, which is like a museum. And
to acknowledge what had been done to this community.
To never forget.
Right.
And it was the Chiso company that poisoned them. But one of the things, when they had to fight and protest since the 1960s to get compensation, but each person got $80,000 at the time.
And there's been a facility built to treat these people who suffer the effects of it.
Yeah.
So I ask you, and I want to hear from both of you, what do you think that if this was a non-Indigenous community that had been poisoned in this way, what do you think the outcome, would you think the outcome would be different, and how?
I think the action would be very swift if it was a non-Indigenous community, and I think that, you know, that the compensation they would be getting would probably be in close to $1 billion or something. Like it would be the action would certainly be very different than what they've done with us.
Like having to beg for scraps.
Yeah.
For decades, and generate government after government, literally with your hand out, begging for any little scraps that they can throw your way. I'm curious, what do you think? How do you think it would be different if it was a non-Indigenous community? Judy?
I think a really good example is the Walkerton experience. Like when I think they said 6 people got like the E. coli, they acted immediately, and that's the kind of action that we should have been given from day one, but it hasn't. It's like continually always asking and begging, and then no action. Even I'm gonna tell you is that with previous governments in 1985, when our people were given the compensation, I think it was $6 million each reserve, and we were told that Dr. John Rudd had done a remediation study, how to clean the river back then. And then what happened was his study got put on the shelf.
Yeah.
And then it was forgotten. Because we didn't ask for the river cleanup, we just got the $6 million and we kept going.
And that $6 million was supposed to rebuild your economy, isn't that what the $6 million was earmarked for? Rebuild an economy on a river system that is toxic. You can't rebuild anything on.
It's gone. And so like the injustice to like not just Grassy Narrows, but like other Indigenous communities are at the front of environmental pollution.
Yeah.
It keeps happening over and over. It's not just Grassy Narrows, like it's all across Turtle Island. Like you go, you know, like where the pipelines are going to be built, like it's always right by Indigenous communities. It's like we're very expendable, and it keeps happening over and over.
Okay, well, we're going to take another break. I thank you, Judy De Silva and Chief Rudy Turtle, for joining us today to talk about this. When we come back, we are going to switch gears to Nunavut's 20th birthday. What benefits did Inuit expect when they voted to separate from the Northwest Territories and form Nunavut versus what's actually been delivered? Stay with us. Welcome back. It changed the map of Canada for the first time in 50 years. Nunavut celebrated its 20th birthday as a territory on Monday. In a special series, APTN reporter Charlotte Moritz-Jacobs partnered with Up Here magazine to travel to several Nunavut communities to find out a bit more about what life is like in the far north and what people hope to see for Nunavut's future. APTN is running this perspective series each day of this week. Let's take a little look.
We have established a public government that will represent all the people of Nunavut equally and democratically.
It's been 2 decades since Nunavut became its own territory. There was lots of hope at the time, but over the years, for many living here, that enthusiasm has withered away.
Out of 1 to 10, I'd give them maybe a 4 because of the situation we're still in, like the cost of living, the foods, the housing.
From food prices to loss of culture to mental health and language erosion. Inuit youth have very real concerns about the future of their homeland.
And so Nunavut itself is created in knowing that there were Inuit who were being treated unfairly, and then they went together and then they created Nunavut. And in the same way, once Nunavut was created, we were left to ourselves.
But others see some progress.
When I look at it as a whole from where I'm standing now, it's just slowly coming together now, where people are coming home. Not everyone, but people are coming home. They want to do better for their community. They want to work. They want to raise their kids here.
And almost everyone believes that more work can be done to help the often misunderstood and underserved territory.
We as a territory did not create any of the systems we have in place. So having a government that is going to be developing these and having them made in Nunavut for Inuit, for young people, would be one of the things that I want to see.
The younger generation, they seem to have like a lot of good ideas.
What do youth need in Nunavut? I'm Charlotte Moritz-Jacobs, and I've traveled to Rankin Inlet, Pangarsung, and Iqaluit asking youth this specific question. We'll hear from community members on topics such as education, self-government, and healthcare. All that and more on APTN National News.
You can watch the next 3 installments of Charlotte's Nunavut tour on APTN National News for the rest of the week. So Nunavut is a vast territory. It's known for its culture, for its people, and it actually has its challenges too. Nation to Nation host Todd Lamran talked to the Premier of Nunavut, Joe Savikata, about some of what those challenges are.
What's been, I guess, the big positive over these 20 years?
I guess the reason it was created was as part of the land claims negotiation process, where if the land claim was settled, then they would get their own territory. And they actually had I remember they had a vote or a referendum, and the vote was to create their own territory, and that was negotiated. And I think it comes from the fact that the Inuit want to control their own destiny, as to opposed to when it was the Northwest Territories, and it seemed like the government was so far away from the Inuit.
I suppose from an Inuit perspective, what's been the big positive from having their own territory for the past 20 years?
I think the fact that the majority of MLAs and the majority of the government ministers have been predominantly Inuit ever since the creation of Nunavut.
Of course, there's been challenges over those 20 years. I suppose what have been some of the biggest challenges?
I guess the one that's the most ongoing, and it's been in the news a lot, is housing needs. And that was an issue back in the creation of Nunavut in 1999, and it's still an issue that we are dealing with today. We just don't have enough houses for the Nunavut Mute that need houses.
Of course, last year the federal budget promised $240 million over 11 years for housing in Nunavut. But is that enough to keep up with the growing demand?
No, it's not. And I'll just say, for example, we need between 3,000 to 3,300 houses right now, right as of today. And the money that we got from the feds for 2019-2020 is enough to build 83 units.
Just 83 units?
Yes.
Okay.
So we're not even keeping up with today's demand, and every day that demand is growing as our population grows.
Back when the territory voted to leave the Northwest Territories and form a territory on their own, there was a lot of promises and expectations that came with that. Joining me now is our Nunavut reporter Kent Driscoll. He joins us from Iqaluit. Let's find out what was expected versus what's been delivered. So the use of Inuktitut declines 1% a year, we just heard, when the original plan for Nunavut would have grown the language. That was one of the reasons for that Nunavut was founded. So why has that not happened? What's the challenge?
Well, Melissa, it's not a simple answer. It's more of a series of answers for that particular question. Okay. Now, the Arctic College program that was set up to create Inuktitut literate teachers, it didn't turn out as many teachers as they had hoped for. And then those teachers that were turned out, well, that's someone with a degree in a territory with not a lot of people who have degrees. So they were being snapped up by the government of Nunavut, by Nunavut Tungavik Incorporated, by private sector. So they were very qualified people, and it left us with fewer teachers. Now, it's so bad with the Inuktitut teacher shortage. Here in Iqaluit, Inuktitut can be taught to English-speaking kids as a second language, much like you'd have in a French class in a Southern English environment. That's not happening right now in Iqaluit because there are too few Inuktitut teachers. So they're doing coloring and sewing in Inuktitut class. And there hadn't been enough development in Inuktitut curriculum. A lot of that has been, they're making moves towards that. But when Nunavut was formed, you had Inuktitut teachers in classrooms sitting there with no materials, no lessons plans, having to start from scratch. So with that sort of hole, it's not hard to see how the language is declining.
Yeah. Well, and I love, it's like a lot of things we see with government. It looks great on paper. We discuss it in theory. You know, as soon as the press conference is done and the lights are off and the cameras are gone, what we actually see come to fruition is a totally different thing. Speaking of which, so we just heard the Premier of Nunavut talk about they need 3,300 homes. The feds are buying 83. What is the problem with getting the housing cash?
Well, the last housing cash came in 2017, and it was in the federal budget, but the scope of the problem is so massive. That money was $240 million over 10 years, and that equals out to about 48 homes a year. Now, as the Premier's very fond of pointing out, 90 to 95% of Nunavut's funding comes from the federal government. So there's so many priorities. So the government of Nunavut has to choose between what they spend their money on. And the other problem is that 3,000 homes in the hole. Right now, to break even, we need 3,000 homes built overnight. And I'll tell you, nobody's building homes overnight in Nunavut.
No, you had said, give us a sense, we're running out of time here, but give us a sense of how much it costs to build a house there and how long it takes.
How much does it cost to build a house? I saw a house in my neighborhood that was listed for $300,000 4 years ago go on the market at $550,000 today. $500,000 is a start, and as the Premier pointed out, nation to nation, that's not a fancy house. That's a kitchen, dining room, couple of bedrooms. And it takes
they take a long time to build as well, like just getting the materials up there.
Oh, exactly. Every community in Nunavut is a fly-in community, so it has to happen in the summer when the boats can land. And then that creates a whole new series of problems where you have all of these materials landing in the community at the same time in sea cans. A lot of work has been done on the logistics and how to better use that limited amount of funding, but without a change in the funding, you're just you're fighting the inevitable.
Oh. Well, thank you so much for joining us, Kent. I always enjoy hearing what's going on up north. Well, I'm still yet to be up there, but I'm going to come and visit you in Iqaluit one of these days.
We're looking forward to it, Melissa.
That is all the time that we have today. Thanks to all of our viewers and our listeners, of course, on Element Radio in Toronto and Ottawa. We'd love to have you join us. This episode will be available for download as a podcast on our website at aptnnews.ca/podcast. And if you missed any of the shows and you want to catch up, you can do so there. I'm Melissa Ridgen. Have a great afternoon.